My new husband's daughter insulted me in front of my family. When I confronted her, he humiliated me. She's not your daughter, don't correct her. I just smiled. Fine. The next morning, her car, tuition, and allowance were all G. I met Mark at a fundraiser I almost didn't attend. I spent 2 hours by the dessert table talking to a man who kept refilling my water glass without being asked, funny in a dry, understated way, listening more than he talked. By the end of the night, he'd asked for my number twice, joking the second time that he wanted a backup in case I'd given him the wrong one on purpose. I liked that he didn't rush anything. We dated for a year before he brought up marriage, careful and almost apologetic about it, like he expected me to say it was too soon. I didn't think it was too soon. I was in my late 30s, established, comfortable enough that I'd stopped assuming comfort was something other people got to have. Mark felt like an addition to that life, not a rescue from it. His daughter was the one complication I saw coming and told myself I could handle. She was 17 when we met, in the middle of the particular kind of grief that doesn't look like grief from the outside. Her mother had died 3 years earlier, and Mark had raised her alone since. I told myself that if I was patient, if I never pushed, she'd come around on her own timeline. She didn't come around. She was polite in the specific way that made clear politeness was the whole offering. Called me by my first name and never anything warmer. Answered questions in the fewest words that counted as answers. Left rooms within a few minutes of me entering them. I noticed. I didn't say anything because I'd convinced myself that saying something would only prove I needed thanking for basic decency. Mark and I married quietly. A small ceremony with immediate family. Nothing that required his daughter to perform enthusiasm she didn't feel. She came. She stood near the back. She left before the cake was cut, and Mark caught my eye in a way that asked me not to make it a thing, so I didn't. The only real disagreement Mark and I had in those first months was about money, and even that wasn't really a disagreement so much as a single conversation that ended the way I wanted it to end. A few weeks after the wedding, he mentioned, almost in passing, that it might make things easier if he were added to one of my accounts. Nothing dramatic, he said, just for convenience, in case something came up while he was traveling for work and I wasn't reachable. He framed it as the kind of practical housekeeping any married couple did eventually. I told him no. Not unkindly, and not because I suspected anything, but because I'd kept certain things separate for a long time before I met him, and didn't see a reason to change that just because we'd gotten married. My accounts were my own history, built over years, some of it tied to decisions and people that had nothing to do with him. I told him we could absolutely combine what made sense to combine, the household expenses, a joint account for the day-to-day, but that a few things were going to stay mine, the way I assumed a few things would always stay his. He didn't push. He said that made sense, said he hadn't meant anything by it, and we never really talked about it again. I remember feeling a small flicker of something when he first brought it up. Not suspicion exactly, more a kind of internal flinch, the same reflex that makes you check a locked door twice even when you know you locked it. I noted it and moved on, the way you note most small things in the early months of a marriage, filing it under nothing, because nothing was still the most reasonable explanation for almost everything back then. What I didn't examine closely enough, not then, was how easily the conversation had ended, how readily he'd dropped it. At the time, I read that as respect for my boundary. It would be a long while before I considered that it might have simply been patience, the kind that waits for a better opening instead of forcing a bad one. His daughter left for college that fall, out of state, expensive, the kind of tuition bill that made my stomach do something complicated the first time I saw the number. Mark didn't ask me to help. I offered, telling myself it was what family did, that refusing felt like a smaller version of myself I didn't want to be. I didn't examine whether I was also offering because it felt like the fastest path to being let in. The tuition became a wire transfer I set up on the first of every month, and once it was automated, I stopped thinking about it as a decision I was actively making. More just a bill, the same category in my mind as the mortgage. That's the thing about generosity that turns into infrastructure. It stops asking you to notice it. There were other things layered on top over the next 2 years. Her car, a sensible used sedan Mark and I bought together, came with an insurance policy I paid in full because the year upfront rate was cheaper, and once I'd done it the first year, doing it again wasn't a choice so much as a continuation. There was a monthly allowance, modest, meant to cover groceries and the incidental costs of being 19 and then 20, that I started sending directly because Mark's business had a rough stretch that year. There was a semester abroad, a laptop that died before finals, a security deposit on an off-campus apartment her sophomore year that I covered because her financial aid check hadn't cleared, and the landlord wasn't interested in waiting. None of it, taken individually, felt like very much. That was almost the point. Each thing was small enough to justify on its own, like getting angry about a single raindrop instead of noticing you'd been standing in weather for 2 years. She still didn't like me. That part never changed, no matter how many wire transfers I sent. She came home for winter break and Thanksgiving and stayed the minimum socially acceptable number of days. Treated conversations with me the way you'd treat filling out a form you'd already filled out 100 times, dutiful and empty. I asked her questions about school. She gave me answers with no follow-up handles, and I learned eventually to stop trying to find the door in a wall that didn't have one. I brought it up with Mark exactly once, carefully, on a night I thought the timing was right. I told him I didn't need her to love me. I just wanted to understand what I'd done that made the distance feel permanent instead of just slow. He got quiet in the way he got quiet when a conversation was heading somewhere he didn't want to follow, and then he said I was overthinking it, that she was like that with everyone. I let it go because pressing further felt like it would cost more than it would gain. There was a night, about a year and a half into the marriage, when I overheard part of a phone call I wasn't meant to hear. Mark was in his home office with the door mostly closed, and I was passing by with a laundry basket, and I caught a fragment of him saying quietly that things were tight again, that he'd figure something out, that he always figured something out. I didn't think much of it at the time. Mark's business, a small commercial contracting outfit he'd built up over a decade, had good years and lean years, and I'd learned early on not to ask too many questions about which kind of year we were currently in, mostly because the answer tended to make him tense and defensive in a way that didn't seem worth the information. I mention it now only because I think about it differently than I did then. At the time, it was just Mark being Mark, a man who carried his business stress the way some men carry a bad knee, quietly and without much complaint, adjusting his gait around it so you'd barely notice unless you were looking. I wasn't looking. I had no reason to be looking. Whatever was tight, he never once asked me directly to loosen it, and I took that as evidence of his integrity, rather than evidence of a plan that didn't require asking. By the time his daughter's senior year rolled around, I had stopped keeping a running total of what I'd spent on her, because keeping the total felt like proof I resented giving it, and I didn't want to be a person who resented giving it. I wanted to be the kind of stepmother whose generosity was so unremarkable it barely registered as generosity at all. I got exactly what I was aiming for. It stopped registering. To everyone, eventually, including me. My sister's anniversary fell on a Saturday that year, and she'd rented the back room of the restaurant she and her husband had married at 25 years earlier, the kind of sentimental full-circle gesture she'd always been drawn to. She'd invited the whole family, and she'd asked Mark and me to come early to help with the flowers, which meant we arrived before almost anyone else, arranging centerpieces on 12 round tables, while afternoon light came in sideways through the tall windows. I remember feeling good that day, genuinely, not performed. Mark and I had been in an easy stretch for a few months, the ordinary, comfortable rhythm of two people who'd settled into being married. His daughter was coming, which she did for major family occasions now, dutifully, and I'd stopped expecting the visits to be warm and started simply appreciating that they happened at all. She arrived a little after 6, in a dress I hadn't seen before, and greeted my sister, my mother, and several cousins with real affection, and me with the same measured first-name hello she'd been giving me for 6 years. I was used to it by then. I told myself, standing near the bar with a glass of wine I was drinking too quickly, that indefinite politeness was still better than open hostility, and that I should be grateful for what I had instead of keeping score of what I didn't. Dinner was served around 7. I sat between Mark and my mother, 3 seats down from his daughter, close enough to hear her laughing at something a cousin said, far enough that I wasn't part of the conversation making her laugh. The room was warm and loud in the way a room full of people who love each other gets loud. I remember thinking, with the wine making the thought feel more profound than it probably was, that I had built a good life, and that whatever gaps remained were the kind everyone has, the kind you learn to live around instead of demanding they close. My sister stood up around 8 to make her toast, glass raised, voice already thick with the kind of happy emotion that comes easily after a good dinner and a few drinks. She talked about 25 years, about the version of her husband she'd married and the version she'd ended up with, about how love was less a single decision than 10,000 small ones made again and again until they added up to something permanent. The room applauded, glasses clinked, and in the small window of quiet that followed, before anyone else could stand to speak next, Mark's daughter rose from her seat with her own glass in hand, smiling in a way I registered, a half-second too late, as not entirely warm. "I want to say something too," she said, and the room's attention shifted toward her easily, the way it shifts toward anyone young and pretty, holding a glass at a family dinner. She was smiling the whole time. "To 25 years, she said, raising her glass toward my sister and her husband. "That's incredible. Real love, actually lasting." She paused, let the sentiment land, let a few people murmur agreement, and then her eyes moved to me, still smiling, still holding the toast posture. "And to Evie," she said, "for renting a room in my dad's life. Here's hoping the lease runs a little longer than usual." There was a beat of confused laughter from a few people who hadn't fully processed what they'd heard, the reflexive laugh a room gives a toast before it's sure whether the toast was a joke. My mother's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. My sister's smile went rigid, uncertain whether to defend the moment or diffuse it. I looked at Mark. I wasn't hoping for a scene, wasn't hoping for him to stand up and deliver some furious defense of my honor in front of 12 tables of family. I was hoping he'd say her name, quietly, in the tone a parent uses when a child has said something that crossed a line, the tone that doesn't need volume to communicate that a line was crossed. He looked at his plate instead. Not at her, not at me. At his plate, like it had suddenly become the most important object in the room. So I said something myself. "That's not okay to say to me," I said. I kept my voice level, quiet enough that it wouldn't carry past our end of the table the way her toast had, aimed only at her, an attempt to handle it the way you'd handle any other family friction, privately, without making everyone else's dinner about it. Mark stood up then. For one full second, maybe less, I thought he was finally going to do the thing I'd been hoping for. He stood the way you stand when you're about to correct something. Instead, he turned toward me, not toward her, and his voice came out louder than mine had, loud enough that every conversation at every nearby table stopped. "She's not your daughter," he said. "Don't correct her." I don't think I fully processed the sentence the first time I heard it. A kind of ringing quiet settled over our corner of the room, the specific silence of a lot of people realizing simultaneously they'd just watched something they weren't supposed to see. My mother set her fork down entirely. Mark's daughter didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. Her father had said it for her, more completely than she ever could have. I felt my face go hot. The particular heat of humiliation delivered in front of your own family by the person who's supposed to stand in front of you when it counts. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice, didn't push back, didn't ask him what he meant. Some old useful part of me understood that arguing would only extend the show, and I had no interest in extending it. I smiled instead. It wasn't a real smile. It was the kind of smile you use as a door closing. Fine, I said. That was the entire exchange. 4 words from her, 5 from him, 1 from me. I picked my napkin back up, set it in my lap, and finished the meal I'd stopped tasting. Nobody said anything else about it for the rest of the night. My sister tried, twice, to steer the table back toward the toast that had been about her and her husband before it briefly became about something else, and both times the conversation limped forward before sagging again. We left a little before 10. Mark drove. He didn't say anything in the car, and neither did I. 20 minutes of highway went by with only the radio, turned low, filling the space where a conversation should have been. When we got home, he said he was tired, kissed the top of my head in the absent, habitual way he'd done it for years, and was asleep within what felt like 10 minutes. I lay there listening to his breathing even out and thought, with a kind of flat clarity I hadn't expected, that I finally understood something I'd been circling for 6 years without landing on directly. It wasn't that he'd chosen her over me at the dinner table. Parents choosing their children in a moment of instinct wasn't, on its own, something I could hold against him. It was that he'd had a choice available that cost him nothing, a version of the moment where he corrected her gently and lost nothing with either of us, and he hadn't taken it. He'd chosen the version that humiliated me in front of my own family instead, and he'd chosen it easily, without visible cost, which told me something about how much my humiliation had actually weighed against whatever it was he thought he was protecting. I got up a little after midnight. I didn't turn on the overhead light, just the small lamp on the kitchen desk, and I opened my laptop and started going through every account that had her name attached to it in any way. I want to say I did it in anger, because anger would make the story simpler, but it wasn't anger. Not really. It was more like closing out a ledger I'd been keeping open far longer than made sense. The tuition wire, the insurance policy, the monthly allowance. One by one, I found the recurring transfers and canceled them, calmly, the way you'd unsubscribe from something you no longer read. It took less than an hour. By 1 in the morning, there was nothing left running anywhere that carried her name, and I closed the laptop and went to bed feeling something I hadn't expected to feel, which was not triumph, not really, just a quiet, settled kind of relief. The feeling of finally putting down something heavy you'd been carrying so long you'd forgotten it had a weight at all. I made coffee the next morning the way I made it every morning, and I was halfway through my first cup when his phone started buzzing on the counter beside mine. It buzzed, went quiet, buzzed again, then started ringing outright. The specific insistence of a call from someone who's already tried texting and been ignored. Mark came downstairs in his robe, saw the screen, and answered, standing in the doorway. I watched his face change in real time, the particular unraveling of someone getting bad news in fragments. His daughter's car had been flagged for repossession overnight. Her tuition transfer, due that week, had bounced. Her monthly allowance, which usually landed the first of the month like clockwork, had simply never arrived. He hung up and turned to face me, phone still in his hand, color draining out of him like watching blood leave a room. "What did you do?" he said. "Nothing," I said, and I meant it exactly as literally as I said it. I stopped doing something. That's different. He sat down across from me at the kitchen table, and for a moment, watching him rub his face with both hands, I let myself believe this might genuinely be the end of it. He apologized. He said the toast had been out of line, said what he'd said at the dinner table had been out of line, said he'd been caught off guard and reacted badly, and he was sorry, actually sorry, not performing sorry. He said he talked to his daughter, that things would get sorted, that he understood if I needed some time before I turned everything back on. That was the false floor, though I didn't have the word for it yet. The apology that cost him nothing to give, delivered easily, arriving so quickly and so fluently that some part of me, the part that had spent 6 years wanting exactly this kind of accountability from him, wanted badly to accept it at face value and let the whole thing close. He reached across the table and took my hand, and I let him. I sat there with my coffee going cold and thought, genuinely, that maybe this was what it had taken, that the accounts closing had done in one night what 6 years of quiet hoping hadn't managed at all. I almost turned everything back on that morning. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't close. I didn't turn anything back on that morning, in the end, though not because I'd figured anything out yet. I told Mark I needed a few days, and he said that was fair. Said he understood, and for the next several days he was, genuinely, a version of himself I hadn't seen much of in years. He came home early from work. He asked me questions about my day and actually waited for the answers. He brought up the dinner twice more, unprompted, each time to apologize again, each time sounding a little more like someone who meant it and a little less like someone performing meaning it, or so I told myself, wanting badly for the second read to be the true one. I watched him more carefully than I let on. Not out of suspicion exactly, not yet, more out of the simple vigilance of someone who's just relearned that comfort can turn out to be misplaced. I noticed the small things. He was quieter on his phone than usual, tended to take calls in his office with the door shut instead of wandering the house talking the way he normally did. I told myself that was reasonable, given everything, that of course he'd want privacy while he sorted out whatever needed sorting with his daughter, and that reading anything else into a closed door said more about my own unease than about him. On the 4th day, I was upstairs folding laundry when his daughter called the house line instead of his cell, an old habit from childhood she still occasionally fell back into, and Mark, not realizing I was close enough to hear, answered from the hallway just below the stairs. I heard maybe half of it, his half, filtered through a door frame and a flight of stairs, but I heard enough. I heard him say, in a low, reassuring voice, that she should just use his card for now, that it was only temporary. I heard him say he'd call the tuition office himself on Monday and get it sorted before any late fee posted. I heard him tell tell her not to worry, that this was a misunderstanding, a word he used more than once, misunderstanding, as though what had happened at the dinner table and everything that followed it were the result of some clerical confusion rather than a decision either of them had made. I stood very still at the top of the stairs with a folded towel in my hands and listened to my husband quietly rebuild, one phone call at a time, exactly the arrangement I had spent an entire night dismantling, all while sitting across from me at breakfast that same week, apologizing like a man who genuinely meant it. That was the actual crack. The moment the apology revealed what it had always been. Not a lie, precisely. He probably did feel sorry in the narrow, immediate sense of regretting that a scene had happened in front of my family and that I'd been hurt by it. But regret over a scene and accountability for a pattern are not the same thing. And what I was watching, standing at the top of those stairs, was a man managing the visible consequence of his choice, while leaving the choice itself completely intact. I went back to folding the laundry. I didn't confront him that afternoon, and I want to explain why. Because I've turned the decision over enough times to trust it wasn't cowardice, even though it might have looked like it from the outside. Confronting him in that moment would have given him exactly what he needed, which was a clear, immediate conflict he could apologize his way through again, the same successful maneuver twice in 1 week. I didn't want to hand him a second round of the thing that had already worked once. My sister called that evening, the way she'd been calling every few days since the dinner, careful and a little tentative, the tone of someone checking on a wound without wanting to poke it. I told her the accounts were still off, that Mark had apologized, that things seemed to be settling. I didn't mention the phone call I'd overheard on the stairs. I wasn't ready to say it out loud yet, not even to her, maybe especially not to her, because saying it out loud would have made it a fact I had to act on instead of a suspicion I could still, technically, be wrong about. She was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line, and then she said something I've thought about often since. She said that in 20 years of watching men apologize for things, she'd noticed the honest ones tended to change one specific thing, usually something small and concrete, and the dishonest ones tended to change everything at once. The tone, the gestures, the flowers, the whole atmosphere of themselves, because performing contrition all at once was easier than the slow, boring work of actually being different in one particular way. I asked her which one Mark sounded like. She said she didn't know him well enough to say, but that I would know, probably already did know, and that I shouldn't let how much I wanted the easier answer talk me out of whichever one I already suspected was true. I didn't sleep well that night, not because I was afraid of anything specific, but because some part of me had already started doing the math. My sister's comment had pointed toward cataloging, almost against my will, everything about the past few days that had changed all at once. The flowers, the early evenings, the attentive questions, the apology delivered fluently and often, as though he'd rehearsed some version of it before he ever said it out loud. Nothing small and specific. Everything, all at once. The whole atmosphere of himself, exactly the pattern she'd described. So I said nothing. I let him believe the reconciliation was landing the way he needed it to land. I kept my coffee routine, my quiet mornings, my careful watching patience, and underneath all of it I started paying much closer attention than I ever had before to exactly what he had access to, and what, up until that week, he had never once asked me to give him. There was one account Mark had never asked about, not once in 6 years of marriage, not even in that single early conversation about combining finances that had ended with me saying no, and him letting it go without argument. It was a personal savings account I'd had since long before I met him, unrelated to anything we shared, the kind of account that exists mostly as a quiet cushion, untouched for most of the year, checked occasionally out of habit rather than necessity. He didn't know the login details. He'd never needed to know them, and I'd never offered. After that afternoon on the stairs, I didn't close it, didn't move the money, didn't do anything that would have announced I was paying attention. I left it exactly as it had always been, sitting there the way it always sat there, and I waited to see whether it would stay that way. The days that followed were strange in a way I don't think I can fully describe to anyone who hasn't lived through a version of it. Mark continued being warm, attentive, apologetic in the low, steady way people are when they believe an apology has already done its work and simply needs maintaining. We had dinner together most nights. He asked about my week. Twice he brought home flowers, unprompted, the kind of gesture that would have meant something to me a month earlier, and now mostly registered as data. One more data point in a pattern I was still assembling without yet knowing its full shape. I went about my days normally, or as close to normally as I could manage. I went to work. I saw friends. I didn't mention any of it to my sister or my mother, both of whom had witnessed the dinner, and both of whom had checked in more than once to see how I was doing, and both of whom I gave some version of the truth that was accurate without being complete, because I hadn't yet decided what the complete version was going to require of me. 3 days after overhearing that call on the stairs, I got a notification on my phone from my bank, the kind of automated fraud alert most people ignore or dismiss without reading closely. I almost did dismiss it. I was standing in a grocery store parking lot, keys already in the ignition when I glanced at it fully enough to register what it actually said, and something in my chest went very still and very cold in the space of about 2 seconds. The alert was for the savings account. A transfer request had been initiated from that account earlier that morning, a substantial amount, more money than I'd have expected anyone to try moving out in a single transaction, and the request had been automatically declined and flagged for manual review because it had originated from a device the bank's system had never associated with that account before. I sat in the parking lot for what felt like a long time before I called the number on the alert. The representative who eventually picked up was patient in the specific practiced tone people use when they field calls from customers who are trying very hard to sound calmer than they feel. She walked me through through what had happened, step by step, in language precise enough that I wrote most of it down on the back of a grocery receipt, because some instinct told me I would want the details exactly right later. That vague memory wouldn't be enough if this went where I suspected it might go. The transfer request had come in at 9:14 that morning, she told me, for an amount just under $11,000, routed toward an external account the system had no prior record of. It had been declined not because of the amount, which was within my normal limits, but because the request had come from a device fingerprint the bank's fraud detection had never seen associated with my login before, paired with an IP address that geolocated to our home address. Someone had accessed my account from inside my own house, using credentials that either matched mine closely enough to pass the first security layer or had been captured somewhere along the way, and had tried to move a significant sum out before the system's own caution stopped it. I asked her carefully whether there was any way to know more specifically which device had made the attempt. She said she could see it had come through a laptop, not a phone, based on the session data, and that if I wanted a full forensic trail, I could request one in writing, which the bank would provide within a set number of business days, along with the exact timestamp down to the second. I thanked her. I hung up. I sat in my car in that parking lot for a long time, engine still off, keys still in my hand, running through the morning in my head. Mark had left for work around 8:30, same as always. He'd been in his home office before that, finishing coffee, using his laptop, the same laptop he'd used the week before to answer a phone call from his daughter with the door closed. 9:14 would have put the attempt squarely inside that window, after he'd have had the house mostly to himself, before he'd have needed to leave. I didn't say anything to him that evening. I wanted the written forensic report first, wanted the exact timestamp and the exact device information in a form I could hold in my hand instead of a version I'd reconstructed from memory and suspicion, because I understood even in the middle of it that suspicion alone wouldn't be enough, not for this, not for a claim this serious against a man who would have every incentive to deny it convincingly. It took 4 days for the report to arrive. When it did, it confirmed everything the representative had told me on the phone, laid out cleanly in the bank's formal language, session ID and device fingerprint and login timestamp all matching, all pointing to the same conclusion. The login attempt on my personal savings account, the one Mark had never asked about and never had reason to access, had come from Mark's laptop, from our house at 9:14 in the morning, exactly 1 week after he had held my hand across the kitchen table and told me, with what I still believe was real feeling in his voice, how sorry he was and how much he understood why I'd needed to do what I'd done. I waited until he got home. I made dinner like it was any other night, and we ate most of it in ordinary conversation, and it wasn't until he was clearing the plates that I set the report on the table, the pages fanned out slightly the way I'd left them after reading it for the 4th or 5th time that afternoon. He looked down at it, and I watched his face do the thing his face had done in the kitchen doorway a week and a half earlier, the same fast unraveling, except this time there was nothing on the other end of a phone call to explain it away. "What is this?" he said, though I could see in the way he asked it that he already knew. "You tell me," I said. He picked up the top page, scanned it, set it back down. He didn't ask a single follow-up question about the transfer amount or the account or how I'd gotten the report, which told me something on its own, because an innocent man would have had questions. He just sat there for a moment with his hand still resting on the page, and then he said quietly that he'd panicked. "You said you were sorry," I said. "You held my hand at this table and told me you understood. That was 1 week before you tried to take $11,000 out of an account you weren't supposed to know existed. I wasn't trying to take anything that wasn't going to come back to you eventually," he said. "I was going to pay it back before you even noticed the balance was different. I just needed to get through the month. The business is behind on 2 contracts, and I didn't want to say anything because I didn't want to give you one more reason to think I couldn't handle this." "You didn't want to give me a reason," I repeated. "So instead you gave me a bank report with your login timestamp on it." He didn't have an answer for that. He looked for a moment, like a man doing rapid math on how much of the truth was already unrecoverable, how much ground he'd actually lost versus how much he could still argue he hadn't. "I panicked," he said again, like repeating it might eventually make it sound like an explanation instead of a description. "You didn't panic once," I said. "You panicked twice. You panicked at the dinner table when your daughter humiliated me, and you had a choice, and you chose the version where I paid the cost. And you panicked again this week when the version where I paid the cost stopped being available, and instead of telling me the business was in trouble, instead of asking me directly the way an actual partner asks for help, you tried to take it without asking at all. That's not fair," he said. "I would have told you eventually." "When?" I said. "Before or after the money was already gone?" He didn't answer that either. He sat there with his hand still on the report, and I watched something settle in his face, not quite guilt and not quite defiance, something closer to a man recalculating what kind of conversation he'd actually walked into. "I need you to understand," he started, and I could already hear the shape the sentence was going to take. Some version of context, some version of pressure, some version of a man explaining why the thing he'd done wasn't really the thing it looked like. "I understand plenty," I said. "I understood the dinner table. I understood the apology. I understood the phone call on the stairs, the one you don't know I heard, where you told your daughter it was only temporary and you'd sort out the tuition office yourself. I understood all of that, and I still sat across from you at this table and let you hold my hand, because some part of me wanted the apology to be real more than I wanted to be right about it not being real." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a car went past on the street, headlights sweeping briefly across the kitchen wall and gone. "So what happens now?" he said, and it wasn't really a question, more a kind of bracing. I looked at the report still sitting between us, the timestamp, the device fingerprint, the plain administrative language of a bank that had no stake in either of our marriages, and had simply recorded, precisely quickly and without any interest in forgiving anyone. Exactly what time someone had tried to take money that wasn't his from an account he wasn't supposed to know I had. I have one question first, I said. If the transfer had gone through, if the system hadn't flagged it, would you have ever told me you'd tried? He opened his mouth, and for a second I thought he might actually answer it honestly, might finally give me the one unguarded sentence I'd been waiting 6 years for. He didn't say anything at all.